My name is Ray McGovern. I grew up in New York, but came down here after John Kennedy suggested that we might ask what we might do for our country rather than what our country might do for us. So I was one of those who came down in the early 60s. I did 2 years as an Army officer in intelligence in the infantry. And then when I heard that the Central Intelligence Agency had a need for people with my background, which included a graduate degree in Russian studies, I said, well, that sounds interesting. Tell me more. And when they told me what I'd be assigned to do, I just got very enthusiastic that I would be in a position of analyzing things that might get to the President of the United States. It was hard for me to believe at first, but it turned out to be true. And it was a very enlivening career for 27 years. That's now I work in the inner city as co-director of the Servant Leadership School, which trains people to become involved with people on the margins, to help them be helped by them, and to be able to sustain that work, which is quite a trick. If you get involved in that work, you very often burn out unless you know certain basic things like the need for community support and that kind of thing.
That's great. What you want to do? Tell me a little bit about what a CIA analyst would do with information that's coming in.
Well, I worked in the Directorate of Intelligence, which was the analytic branch of the CIA, and we were really pretty much tasked with doing the most important tasks of the CIA, which are two, really. One is to sit as...
Okay. Background noise.
It's really loud.
Yeah.
Was that a plane?
Yeah.
You just might want to wait for it to go by.
We should have plugged in with Homeland Security to get this all quarantined off today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was an all-source analyst, and that meant that I would come in the morning, and in my inbox would be data, information from open sources, from spies, from liaison services, from intercepts, from overhead photography, from attaché or embassy reports. The whole spiel on my area of interest, which was Soviet foreign policy, would be right there in my inbox. It would be my task to make some sense out of it. And when I referred to the main tasks of the CIA when it was established in 1947, the overriding need was one central place. Okay, they had been through Pearl Harbor. There were little snippets lying out there, but no central place where one person has all the information that's possible to have before one draws up conclusions. And so that's one. The other aspect that's very important is that we be a place where you can speak the truth without fear or favor, where we don't have to worry about what the State Department is saying, what Defense Department is saying, that we could really look at this information, come up with our conclusions based solely on the merits of the case, and ensure that that gets to the president, which was pretty heady stuff, which is hard to believe in this town because this town is so politicized that when you tell someone that there's one place created by Congress not to have a political agenda, there's sort of, the general reaction is eyes water over, and the shoulders shrug, and there are sort of just feelings of disbelief that could be possible. And the closer you work with Congress, of course, the harder it is to believe that it's possible. And the supreme irony and the terrible damage that has been done is that this administration has made it well nigh impossible to speak without fear or favor.
So, talk a little bit about the build-up to the war, when you were tracking the news and following the news, and kind of draw some analogies about how you would use kind of the mosaic theory of analysis, where you're taking information for a lot of different sources and kind of piecing together a big picture of what was going on.
Yeah, I guess I had a terrific advantage because I cut my teeth in intelligence analysis on the Soviet Union. And the information on the Soviet Union in those days was 90% open source information. Actually, there's a subdiscipline of political science called media analysis, which are people starting in 1941 after Pearl Harbor monitoring Japanese broadcasts. There are people refined to a real science, and And anyone watching the Soviet Union, anyone analyzing the Soviet Union would have to become a master at that science. It was almost like you got an MS in that before you could do anything useful. And so it came to me naturally. And so when I watched, starting 18 months ago, when I watched the administration banging the drums for regime change in Iraq, and thought that rather odd, we hadn't been in the business of invading countries to cause regime change before. Then I started looking at the evidence very, very closely, and my colleagues as well, some of the alumni that I respect very much, that I worked with for 27 years, were also watching this closely. And we would compare notes when we wrote an op-ed or another kind of article, and we'd give each other sanity checks, because some of the conclusions we were coming up with were pretty strange, with respect to what this administration was trying to do. And so in January, we decided that those of us who had been giving each other these sanity checks, perhaps we could form a movement that would be perhaps bigger than the sum of its parts. And so we did. 5 of us formed the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And the sanity comes from those sanity checks, and also from the fact that there wasn't a lot of sanity going on here in this town at the time. I mean, the people who were running our Iraq policy were well known in the 80s as the crazies. That's when you said, "Oh, the crazies did this," everyone knew exactly who was meant. It was Wolfowitz, it was Feith, it was Wormser, it was Bolton. Who am I leaving out? Sometimes it was Cheney, Rumsfeld. They were known as the far-out folks that really had to be kept far out. And so the president's father, for example, when one of the crazies, Wolfowitz, came up with a document for the Pentagon called the Defense Posture Statement in early 1992, it was so outrageous that someone leaked it to the New York Times, and President Bush the first was faced with the decision, how do I handle this? So he called in Brent Scowcroft as National Security Advisor and Jim Baker as Secretary of State. And I thought we were able to contain these crazies. Who wrote this? Well, it was Wolfowitz in Defense. Oh, God. Well, what do we do with it? We throw it in a circular file, so we do it, and we disavow it right away, which he did, And he called Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, and said, look, no more of this stuff from Wolfowitz. Huh? Let's be a little bit more sensible. Now, the supreme irony is that we watch these crazies come back into town with President Bush's son. And they weren't at middle levels of the Pentagon anymore. They were running our policy toward the Middle East, and still are. And so that's really the really major problem there. Get another.
Yeah, that's fine. I wanted to ask you about kind of a sense of history that the media will sometimes forget to incorporate and put things into context. On September 15th, the Sydney Herald in Scotland broke the link between Paris for New American Century, connecting it with Iraq, and that was the first time anyone had made that connection. And then it showed up in England and Australia, all these foreign countries. So talk a little bit about, if it's appearing in the open press overseas, how is that being interpreted by their intelligence agencies, and how is that a document like that incorporated to their decisions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the most interesting indication of how the foreign press and foreign intelligence services found it a little easier to get it right was the example of Andrew Wilkie in Australia. Now, he was a senior intelligence officer. He had already had a career in the military, retired as an Army colonel. There aren't all that many Army colonels in the Australian Army, and went into intelligence. And in his testimony, he quit 8 days before the war because he couldn't abide the deceit that was going into justifying the war. He testified before a joint committee of their parliament that we have our own little unit that analyzes U.S. foreign policy. Now, in the trade, we say there is no such thing as a friendly intelligence service. Okay, we all monitor, we all analyze the policies of one another's government. That's just the way it is, the way it has to be. Well, his analysts of American foreign policy, the ones in the Office of National Assessments, which is Australia's opposite number to CIA, had come up with the real reasons for this war. And it didn't have anything to do with WMD, weapons of mass destruction. It didn't have anything to do with the non-existent ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. It had everything to do with the documents and the thinking incorporated in the Project for a New American Century documents. And those documents were written by the crazies. And these same crazies who were working also for the Israeli government and wrote similar documents for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example. And so those were the documents that made it clear to people like Andrew Wilkie and his colleagues in the Australian Intelligence Service that it was a much different case. There was a much different U.S. objective than what they were saying rhetorically. And so Andrew Wilkie made this known in his testimony and said, look, don't pretend to have been deceived by this. We told you. We told you exactly what the Americans were doing. And all it took was a familiarity with the web and just typing in project for a new American century.com or org, whatever it is. And it is the Mein Kampf of the neocons. You know, Mein Kampf was what Hitler used, strategic ideological justification for what he did. Well, so too is this strategic ideological vision, the justification, if you will, for what they call a preemptive war. But since there was nothing to preempt, it can only be called a war of aggression.
Okay, I'm going to move to kind of the overview picture of the propaganda campaign of what we know now. Maybe a quick overview of the different main points, trying to establish that the premise that there was an orchestrated, coordinated, PR campaign and propaganda campaign to sell the war, and then move on to kind of the timeline and leading up to the war. So why don't you talk a little bit about the propaganda campaign, from your perspective?
Well, the propaganda campaign went hand in glove with the political campaign to get permission or to get approval from the U.S. public and from the Congress for this war. The decision was made in spring of 2002 to have this war. Andy Card, the chief of staff of the White House, made that famous remark, well, you don't market a new product in August. And so we were all waiting for some dramatic announcement in September. Vice President Cheney, however, a real aficionado of preemptive strikes, did his own little preemptive strike, still in August. So while the Secretary of State Powell was sunning himself in East Hampton, and while the president was still down in Texas, Cheney got up before the microphones and set the tone by saying Saddam Hussein is embarked on a search for nuclear weapons. He could have one soon. And UN inspectors, so that's a feckless exercise. Never achieved anything, never will, so don't go down that road at all. Really extreme positions. Everybody else out of town, this was the new policy. So when they came in from out of town after Labor Day, they sat around and they said, well, okay, now, what do we need to do? Well, we need to, somebody said, well, there's this Constitution, and bummer, it says that Congress has the power to declare war, so I guess we ought to bring Congress into this and get them to approve it. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, how about Cheney's? Well, they're not going to be persuaded by Cheney's speech. How about that brand new national security strategic document that we just issued last week? A lot of them don't like this idea of preemption, so we got to give them something substantive to hang on to. Well, what could that be? Well, how about the ties between Iraq and Al Qaeda. I mean, that's, tie that with 9/11. That's going to work.